It's our privilege to be visiting with William J. Reynolds today, professor of church music at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I believe he began his work there in 1980. And Bill, we're going to ask you, if you would, just to share with us a little about your own background and how you got into the positions of church music and ministering that you are today. Where were you born?
I was born in Atlantic, Iowa, in my mother's family home. This was a Danish community, and I was born in the same house she was born in Atlantic. And when at the tender age of 5 months, I moved my parents to Oklahoma. My father was a minister of music, and we settled in Altus, Oklahoma, out in the shortgrass country corner of southwest Oklahoma, where my father was the assistant pastor. He was not ordained, but this was the label that they then gave music and education people in churches, and he was one of the pioneers who came out after World War I, serving in Southern Baptist churches. And I spent most of the first 20 years of my life in Oklahoma. The last few years of that, I graduated from high school in Childress, Texas, where again my father was working with the Baptist church there. I went to school in Oklahoma at Oklahoma Baptist University for a couple of years, then to Missouri, where I found a church that would let me lead the singing and help pay my way through school. And I finished college in Springfield at Southwestern Missouri and came to Southwestern Seminary. I finished Southwestern Seminary, went to North Texas for a year, finished a master's degree there in music during the great days of Wilfred Bain. Went to Ardmore, Oklahoma, and then to First Church, Oklahoma City, where I had 8 great years with Herschel Hobbs. I married the first few months I was there, a young lady who was on the staff of the church. The Lord gave us 2 fine boys. We moved to Nashville in 1955, where I worked part-time at the Sunday School Board for Dr. Sims, and finished a doctorate at George Peabody College. 1980, came to Fort Worth and have been on the faculty at Southwestern Seminary ever since.
As we prepare to celebrate 50 years of organized church music in the state of Texas, Sam Prestige and I could not think of anyone that would be more knowledgeable about the history of music in general and about the history of music in Texas. We know you've written a number of books on hymnology and other matters. I think even now you're writing a book or doing some research for Southwestern Seminary. We'd like for you just to go back as far back as you have maybe researched and can draw out some interesting stories for us, sharing things that we might be interested in about church music in the state of Texas.
Well, Ronnie, when you look at the tremendous things that are going on in Texas and Baptist churches and in the people called Baptists today, we need to look back across the years and think about some people who contributed to this line of development even back into the early part of the 19th century when Texas was wild and primitive, and some people who bore the name of Baptist began to trickle into Texas from other states. And there were some Baptist preachers who felt called of the Lord to preach the gospel, and they came to Texas to preach. And they brought with them the songs that they knew and the hymnals from which they had sung in their states back home. And we see a tremendous influence and a multicultural background even in those early years. In the 1820s, Freeman Smalley from Ohio or Pennsylvania, who is credited with preaching the first sermon, Baptist sermon, in Texas in the early 1820s. Joseph Bays from North Carolina came preaching. In the 1830s, there was Isaac Reeds from Tennessee, Abner Smith from Alabama, Daniel Parker from Illinois, Thomas Pilgrim from New York, Z.N. Morrell, who was a famous early preacher in Texas, he came from Tennessee. In the 1840s, there was Eli Mercer from Georgia, who was a cousin of Jesse Mercer, who published a hymnal earlier in the century. And I'm sure he brought his uncle's book with him, and they sang from it in Texas. There was James Huckins from New Hampshire, William Tryon from New York, and Rufus Burleson from Alabama, who became the first president of Baylor University. He went to school in Nashville and in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm sure that the songs that they were singing in those days of his student days, he brought with them to Texas and introduced them to people in Texas. With the annexation of Texas in 1845 into the Union and the triumph of the war over Mexico, there were many others who came flooding into Texas, and among these were some Baptist preachers from Virginia and Georgia and Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky. I think we can safely assume that these preachers brought with them the hymns they were singing back in the states where they grew up. They brought with them the hymns of Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley and John Newton and Joseph and Samuel Stennett and Robert Robinson and others. They not only brought the words-only hymnals of Staunton Burdett, of Andrew Broadus, of Jesse Mercer, but they brought with them those oblong tune books of B.F. White and William Walker. The tunes of the Fossil Law tradition, the four-shape notation, were sung in the churches that used these words-only books, and the tunes had to be familiar. In 1879, A.J. Showalter, who had been a student in the Rubush Kiefer schools in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, came to Giddens, the community of Giddens in Lee County, Texas, about 40 miles east of Austin, and he held a 2-month singing school. And this was the first introduction of seven shape note singing in Texas. During this time, he visited a family that he knew in Cherokee County, and they had an all-day singing in Cherokee on Christmas Day, the first ever held in the state of Texas. It was in Giddens that Showalter met a charming young lady, Miss Callie Whopper, whom he married in 1881 and took her back to Dalton, Georgia, where he settled. A year later, December 1880, Showalter was invited to hold a singing school in the Methodist Church in Rusk, Texas. And the following July of 1881, he held a singing school at the Old Harmony Presbyterian Church, 3 miles northeast of Alto, or 9 miles south of Rusk. All of these singings used the Rubush Kiefer books. A famous Baptist preacher in Texas who came from Tennessee, settled in Jefferson, Texas, was W.E. Penn. He'd been a major in the Confederate Army during the war between the states, and he was called Major Penn the rest of his life. He held camp meetings throughout Texas. He was faithful to the Baptist cause. He proclaimed a pure and simple gospel and introduced organs and hymnals and song leaders in his work. He had about 6 different men who carried with him to play the organ and lead the singing in his meetings. He published several hymnals, all of them called Harvest Bells. Harvest Bells number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. He used these in his meetings, and these eventually became a standard for the all-day singings in Texas. I think you'll be interested in one story about Major Penn. He was in Waxahachie, near Waxahachie, preaching a camp meeting, and when he tried to open there were 4 men who came out from town. It was a cloudy, threatening rain, and they were doing their best to stop the meeting, and they were drinking, singing loudly, profane in their language. The men went out to try to stop them. Finally, Major Penn went out to try to persuade them to stop, and they would not pay any attention. And finally, Major Penn went into the little congregation and said, "Dear folks, we've done the best we can do. We're going to have to get on our knees and pray that if the Lord wants us to start this service, He'll stop the noise." And he got on his knees in front of those people and poured out his heart in prayer. And before he finished the prayer, lightning struck that tree and killed those 4 men. And Dr. Albert Venting, who told me that story years ago, said that revival meeting broke out all over that county. And this was one of the many instances in this ministry of Major Penn, who died in 1895. But the books that he published were widely used through the Southwest, but lay a strong foundation for what we're doing today. I need to mention H.N. Lincoln, who was born in Missouri in 1869, who traveled for a while with Major Penn as song leader and organist. He was educated in Chicago in a couple of schools there. He settled in Texas in 1893 in Dallas. He was first associated for a short time with A.J. Showalter, and here again is the influence of Showalter in our state. Before 1800, Lincoln set up his own publishing company in Dallas and published more than 20 songbooks, together with several books that dealt only with the rudiments of music, and used these in his singing schools. He was president of the World's Normal Music College in Dallas, and for a while was dean of music at Howard Payne College in Brownwood. He was a member of the First Baptist Church of Dallas and a good friend of Robert H. Coleman, and urged him to begin his publishing. Robert H. Coleman was a successor to H.N. Lincoln and to Major Penn, a native of Kentucky who came and settled in Plano, Texas. He became associated with Dr. George Truett at First Baptist Church and served as his associate for many years. He was superintendent of Sunday school. He led the congregational singing in the morning and evening services. He got into the songbook publishing business, and between 1909 and 1939, he published 33 collections. The most significant of these probably were the Modern Hymnal, 1926, and the American Hymnal of 1933, both widely used books in Southern Baptist churches, as well as some other denominations that seized upon the value of those books. From 1919 until 1935, B.B. McKinney served as his music editor in addition to his teaching at Southwestern Seminary. McKinney had come to Southwestern in 1915, the year the School of Music began, and graduated in 1919, joined the faculty there, and taught a full load, but he also helped Coleman and served as his music editor. He helped prepare manuscript for his books, for the plate-making process. He harmonized tunes, and he read proof for Coleman, and was an excellent choice for Coleman's sake. He not only was a very popular, not only worked for him, but he was a very popular evangelistic singer, involved in a lot of revival meetings. He led the music at the encampments. He became famous at Falls Creek in Oklahoma, and of course everywhere he went, he promoted Coleman's books, and people bought them. I remember McKinney at Falls Creek when I was a lad, and he really controlled and impacted and influenced Baptist church music in Oklahoma through those years. And we all sang out of the Coleman books in Oklahoma. They were very popular up there. Okay. J.R. Baxter, a native of Alabama, became a student of A.J. Showalter, and in 1923 he became manager of the branch of the A.J. Showalter business in Texarkana, Texas. The next year, V.O. Stamps, a native Texan, opened the V.O. Stamps Music Company in Jacksonville, Texas. 2 years later, Stamps and Baxter became partners in the Stamps-Baxter Music Company, with Stamps running the Jacksonville office and Baxter running the office in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In 1929, they moved from Jacksonville to the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. In 1926, Stamps-Baxter began printing one convention songbook a year, and in 1933, they were publishing 2 a year, January and June every year, and people grabbed those books, and they were used in the singings all over the state. 1936, the Stamps Quartet was featured on radio station KRLD. At first, they sang only secular songs, but after a few days, they slipped in some gospel songs, and the response of the radio audience was phenomenal. And before many days passed, they were singing nothing but gospel songs. And this added tremendously to the popularity of gospel singing of the convention style and the popularity of the Stamps-Baxter books. The first all-night singing was held in Dallas in 1938. 2 years later, V.O. Stamps died, and in the reorganization of the company, finally in 1945, Frank Stamps separated from Stamps-Baxter and formed his Stamps Quartet Music Company. The great popularity of this convention type of singing, as it was referred to, really cratered in the 1940s. but it had been extremely popular. Singings were held in the consolidated school buildings. Fifth Sunday singings were extremely popular, and hundreds of people would gather in these school buildings and sing all day long on Sunday. There was opposition in Baptist churches to this. Pastors were opposed to it, not because of the kind of music they sang, but because of the fact that people with their offerings left and went to the singings, and this hurt the churches financially. I.E. Reynolds at Southwestern Seminary was strongly opposed to Stamps Baxter music. After V.O. Stamps died in 1940, many of his students said to him, you'll never be happy when you get to heaven because V.O.'s already got there and he'll have the place sold down with shape note Stamps Baxter books, and you'll not be happy when you get there. The fear of that convention-style singing taking over Texas Baptist church music never occurred. It has diminished. There is still a little strain of it going on. You have some Southern quartets that are still popular, but the publishing of those songs has almost ceased. Zondervan bought the Stamps Baxter Company in 1974. They did not realize what they had. They didn't understand the tradition. They really didn't want the publishing income. They wanted the musical value or the financial value of the copyrights of the songs that were in the Stamps catalog. And so we've seen a waning of that particular emphasis in our day. And for instance, in our hymnals of the last several decades, there are no Stamps Baxter songs that reflect the tradition of that culture in such songs as Give the World a Smile Each Day or On the Jericho Road with the lead lines and the echo lines. None of those songs exist in our hymnals or in any standard hymnals in the United States today. So that influence has slipped away. There are those that would say to you perhaps that Victory in Jesus is a Stamps Baxter song because Stamps own the copyright to this for the first 28-year period. E.M. Bartlett, who wrote this in 39, died in 41, but he sold it to Stamps Baxter before he died, and they had it through that time. Albert Brumley has it since that renewal in 67, I believe. It was sometime about then that we became very fond of this song. I had the joy of putting it in the first hymnal published by the board, which is an independent hymnal called Christian Praise in 1964, and I had a great deal of criticism from some dear friends who were very open to say that was wrong and this should not have been in a songbook published by the Sunday School Board. And I think their objection to it was the fact that the copyright line said Stamps Baxter Music Company owned the copyright. But it has gone like wildfire across our convention and is a dearly loved song today. But we haven't only sung it the last 25 years. It's been of recent time. Now I'd like to turn to Southwestern Seminary that, as you know, began at Baylor University in 1908. B.H. Carroll, who was pastor of the First Baptist Church in Waco and was teaching there, was responsible for getting this started. And in 1910, he moved this to Fort Worth, Texas, and found some acreage out in the southwest part of town and began the seminary there on what was bald ground, no trees, nothing at that time. And Fort Worth Hall was built that year. A little later, what now is called Barnard Hall was built, and those were the first two buildings on the campus. 1910, the spring of 1910, L.R. Scarborough became the president of the school following Dr. Carroll's death. Scarborough went to the Southern Baptist Convention in Houston that year, and there he saw a tall, handsome, gifted singer named I.E. Reynolds. And he was so impressed with him, and he said, "Why don't you come to my seminary in Fort Worth and teach music?" And Reynolds had never thought of this. He'd grown up in Alabama. He'd been to the singing schools there, and he learned to sing shape notes. He played the mandolin. He'd become quite proficient on the mandolin and was known as the best mandolin picker on Canoe Creek in outside of Birmingham. He had been working for the Home Mission Board for 5 years as an evangelistic singer in the Department of Evangelism that began in 1910 as a result of the spiritual awakening that had first begun a few years earlier in Wales. And it swept across the country, and out of this, Southern Baptist established the first evangelism conference at the Home Mission Board, and they employed a number of preachers and a number of singers. And the first evangelistic singer they employed was I.E. Reynolds, who had been working in Mississippi a bit before that in evangelistic work. So for 5 years he worked at the Home Mission Board, and it was in that capacity he was serving when Scarborough saw him at the Southern Baptist Convention and invited him to come to Fort Worth. In September he came to Seminary Hill to begin teaching. He had been several years to school at Moody Bible Institute and had studied under D.B. Towner, the head of the music department there. This is the man that wrote the tune at Calvary. He also wrote Trust and Obey. He wrote a lot of gospel songs. He and Reynolds were friends, and when Reynolds came to Fort Worth to teach, he was in a maze. He'd never dreamed that he would be involved in that kind of responsibility. He really started that fall just like Moody Bible Institute, so that Southwestern Seminary in its beginning was a child of the music program at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. In December, he got on the train and rode back to Chicago and spent several days with Dr. Towner saying, "Please tell me what to do." In the spring of 1916, Dr. Towner came to Fort Worth and spent a week with I.E. Reynolds, with the students, and with the faculty, giving counsel and guidance and advisement in a very wonderful way. The school grew. 1926, Cowden Hall was built to house the School of Music. As far as we know, it's the first building ever built dedicated to the glory of God and the cause of church music. 2 years later, in 1928, I.E. Reynolds went to the Texas Baptist Convention in Mineral Wells in November and presented a resolution to the convention to encourage work in the interest of better music programs in all church worship and services. 1934, another resolution was offered to the state convention asking for, quote, the establishment of some agency for the purpose of aiding the churches and in improving their music programs. In 1937, another resolution was offered to the state convention, this time at El Paso, requesting that the executive board consider establishing some sort of a state denominational church music education program of the plan that would aid the churches in planning and rendering more wholesome, appropriate, and effective church music. In 1944, the Committee on Music and Worship in the State Convention recommended that the Executive Board employ a suitable church musical education leader whose primary work shall be the promoting of better music in our churches. On December 5, 1944, the Executive Board voted to employ J.D. Riddle as Secretary of the Department of Church Music. He came to work in Dallas on January 1, 1945. Let me add a personal experience in this at this point and tell you that 1944 I served in the maritime service during World War II. I came back about Christmas time to the seminary, picked up my work as a student. My uncle was ill, and I picked up part of his teaching load. And I remember in January, the first week or so of January, J.D. Riddle came to Fort Worth, spent the morning with I.E. Reynolds, visiting with him, seeking advice and counsel about his new job. And after lunch, I ran into him in the hall of Cowden Hall, and we sat down and talked for, an hour or more. During the time I was in training in St. Petersburg, Florida, the previous year, I worked in the training office, and the CPO leader for that section was a Baptist boy from Michigan. And when he found that I enjoyed singing and was musically inclined, he invited me to go with him to the First Methodist Church. This was under the supervision of a minister of music who was a graduate of the Westminster Choir College, whose name was Earl Evans. He had 3 choirs. He gave free voice lessons to all the folks in his choir. And here I got indoctrinated for several months under his leadership. He walked in 3 choirs every Sunday morning, all robed, The choir loft, the adult choir was in the choir loft, and it was about halfway between the ground floor and the balcony. He had balcony choirs to the right and left so that he could conduct those, and each of the three choirs did something in the service, the anthem, the call to worship, or response of some kind. People in St. Petersburg raved about the music at the First Methodist Church, and I had this contact with that for a number of months while I was there. I shared that information with J.D. Riddle about my experience with this Methodist church and with this three-choir program and what this meant to that church and all, and how exciting it was. And he got very much excited and said, "Hey, where can I find a book about this?" And I said, "J.D., it's not in the book. John Finley Williamson made all of his students promise that they would never write a book about his techniques and methods. And he would almost make them swear on a Bible that they would never put this in print. And this is the reason we have nothing in writing about what we came to call, not really truly, the Westminster Plan." But this was my early contact with J.D. and his beginnings in Texas and seeing that happen. As I mentioned earlier, I left and went to Oklahoma in '46. So in those years, I was not a part of the immediate early years of the state program in Texas that J.D. led. I came later out of my personal contact in the years I was in Nashville, of having a close friendship with Pete Fortehays and with Sam, and have had in that relationship an opportunity to witness the tremendous things that have happened in Texas. The increase in enrollment, the growth of the programs in the churches, the contribution that the State Department has made to the churches in providing leadership training opportunities, particularly for the small churches where they rely on volunteer leadership and they need help and they need information and they need inspiration. And the church music department in Texas has done this in a tremendous state, geographically spread out and hard to find, the smaller churches particularly, and involve them in that way. But they've done a magnificent job across the state. And I would have words of great appreciation for all the states and these state leaders that have made such a contribution across the years. And I would say honestly that in my heart, I believe that probably the greatest credit for the growth and development across these years, particularly these 50 years in Texas, has to go to state music leaders who have driven the highways, who have met with churches large and small, and who have provided opportunities of growth and development and have challenged music leaders in the churches. In Texas, the growth of the Singing Men of Texas, for what this has meant not only musically but spiritually and psychologically in Texas. And it has formed a fellowship of church musicians that's unequaled anywhere. And the church music department has done this. And for this, I'm very grateful.
We're delighted to be visiting with Billiam J. Reynolds.
Sam,
with Bilious J. Reynolds. We're delighted to be visiting today with William J. Reynolds, professor of music at the Southwestern Baptist
Church
Theological
music.
Seminary.
Start this over. Church music.
All right. I had done so good on that. We're delighted to be visiting today with William J. Reynolds, professor of church music at Southwestern Seminary.
Go back one more time.
I need to scratch my face anyway. Smile, Ron.